been interested in the application of geospatial technologies to create more culturally informed representations of the landscape, of all kinds of landscapes, since about 2012. I've been working for the Tŝilhqot'in Nation in BC's West Central Interior since 2014. I started as a GIS technician, and I've worked on a number of different projects, including wild mushroom permitting mapping, wildfire progression mapping, and conducting ethnographic mapping interviews for land use and occupancy studies, as well as a number of other projects. But my sort of pet project, the one I love doing the most, is working to update and maintain the Tŝilhqot'in place name inventory. And so much so that I decided, maybe the best way of moving forward with this project is to devote some serious time to it. So I took it with me to the University of Victoria, where I'm currently a master's student in anthropology, and it's part of my master's research. But through my MA work, I've been encountering an overwhelming number of theoretical directions in place name research, and I've gone down that rabbit hole, and I don't think I've come out the other end yet. Digging through it all has been fascinating and frustrating, and reading, Plato to Heidegger, Franz Boas to Keith Basso, Yi-Fu Tuan, J.L. Austin. I could go on for hours and hours about why and how people name places, how place name systems differ and how they're the same, and how place names are windows onto worldviews as well as tools for colonization. But I'm not going to do that today. Instead of dragging everyone down into the theoretical rabbit hole with me, as I was planning to do, last minute I decided to talk more about a different idea, one that I haven't seen too many people writing about, and one that maybe challenges us cartographers who are trying to include more Indigenous perspectives on maps. So it's kind of daunting to follow Chris, but also I think our presentations might go well together. So I want to talk about how place names and place name systems in colonial and Indigenous contexts are entangled together and how we're entangled with them. And to do that, I wanted to just briefly start by discussing the Tŝilhqot'in language. It's a member of the Na-Dene or Athabascan language family. The Tŝilhqot'in pocket is located just down here. It's kind of a unique geographical area, given the distribution of the languages to the north, and then the Apache, Navajo, and languages to the south. And the territory is located in this sort of location. This is a place name map that I've worked on through my job here at the Tŝilhqot'in Nation, and it shows just sort of the main place names in a nice, easy to access form, mostly for use with kids. And the work we've done to date is sort of to try and take this really oral and verbal phenomenon of naming places and to try and be able to replicate it onto maps. But for generations and since the beginning of time, place names have been passed down through these oral ways. And the orthography for writing the language wasn't developed until the 1970s. Early place name documentation was sort of missed by the ethnographic world that I'm sure Ken's presentation would have touched on, which is sad to see. Hopefully we can get you in because it would also really highlight a lot of the same things. But William Myers of Untitled, he's a Tŝilhqot'in knowledge keeper, and he started mapping place names in the 1980s, 1990s, informally and without the use of computer technology, software, or anything. But that was really built on by the traditional use studies that the nation and the communities here have done since, 1999 was the big push. Mostly done for strength of claim, but the place name mapping took place as part of that. But we ended up with a pretty rough data set. There was lots of errors and huge numbers of gaps. There were about 400 names and a lot of duplicates, wrong locations. So a 2016 project that I was glad to be a part of and what sort of spurred my real passion and love for this subject was to really fix up this data set and fill it in as best we can. But of course, we found more and more data, and we found more and more gaps and more errors. And so that's why I decided to bring this to my master's research. But just a quick disclaimer, there's a lot to talk about with Tŝilhqot'in place names, the deep ancestral connections that they provide between people and places, languages and landscapes. And this is not a presentation about those topics. I just don't have the time. Instead, I want to talk about something different, something weird, and maybe something we haven't really thought much about. So back to this map, I'm going to center in first for two examples. First example is going to be down here in Khani or Namaya Valley. And so here we zoom in. So this is the lake I want to talk a little bit about and the area. And I'm going to throw on the BC's official place names. So with the little X's, those are the gazetted place names of BC's official data set. And you'll notice this name here, Khani, it's a Tŝilhqot'in name. It was a name that we suggested and requested that BC adopt. It's the name of the indigenous community here, Tŝilhqot'in. But that's sort of what the standard map would look like. Now, I'm going to shock you all and show you what the indigenous place names look like for this area. Holy. Yeah.
You're always seeing is your first slide.
Oh, that's not good.
Shared.
Is it moving?
No.
No, sorry, Shane, you didn't start the slideshow going?
Oh, I did. I will try sharing my screen a second time. So, oh, that's too bad. How's that?
Well, we see a later slide.
Yeah, okay. Is it saying Untitled? You see a map of North America?
Do.
Okay, do you see a little yellow splotch coming onto it?
I see that.
Okay, so we should be good.
Perhaps someone else can confirm. I'm not.
Yeah, we can see it, but you're still in your sort of editing mode. You have to start the slide show going.
Yeah, it started. I'm not sure why. Anyway, if you can see it, I'm just going to continue.
Great.
No? Okay.
Okay, so we talk.
Mode.
You see it?
It's not in presentation.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just run through it. I don't have much time. So this is the map I was discussing, and this. So we'll skip through that. So here we are. Can we all see this map and the little red box popping up? Okay.
No, it's just the map of North America still.
Okay. Well, this is not.
There it is.
Running. It's working now?
You see the map with the little red box.
Okay, let's skip down to it. Map with the little red box. And now you see a lake. Just to confirm, Byron.
Still a map with a little red box.
Okay, we're just going to cancel the presentation then. And I'm just going to run through the slides and just do it verbally. Okay, my video's on. Cool. All right. So the indigenous place names, they're scattered. There's hundreds. They're different. The spellings are all different. They're entangled. They're covering each other. And everything, the geographic extents are challenging to understand. Working towards an inventory of place names is something that requires a lot of in-depth research with community members, talking about names, their variation, their extents, their pronunciation, and different people pronounce place names in different ways. So one example I'd like to talk about is Khani, which is Connie Lake, or also known as Namaya Valley. And I'm just going to try this out on entire screen because it's just so fascinating. I want everyone to see some of these pictures. So I'm going to skip back over here. How's that?
Yep, see the lake.
Okay, cool. So I'll skip quickly back up. So these are the indigenous place names I was talking about, scattering all across the territory. And this does not lend itself to the kind of cartography that Chris is talking about. There's something else going on here. And this is what the place name inventory looks like. So trying to tidy it up, give some unique identifiers, but really we're still missing a big part of the conversation with that variation. So this place name, for example, Khani, there's two variations in our data. One is called Khani B and the second is called Nawtanakut B. And after digging, we have found that nobody really knows where that name Nawtanakut B came from. And it's Khani B, that's the name that most people understand, most people know. But also, in Tŝilhqot'in culture and in the place naming system of that territory, lakes themselves aren't often named directly. A lake is often named for the area it's in. In this case, Khani B means the lake at Khani or in Khani. It's not Khani Lake, for example. Or typically a part of a lake would be named, not the whole thing. But what Khani actually means, what it translates to, nobody knows. And it's just sort of a sign of how deep and how long these names have been used. So the colonial counterpart that Chris was discussing, in this case, would be Connie Lake. But Connie is an anglicization of Khani, and it also has its own spelling variation. And at the end of the day, this whole area, Khani, is also analogous to this idea of Namaya Valley, which would be another colonial counterpart, but which also has multiple spellings throughout the records. And it is named after a Tŝilhqot'in chief named Nimaya. So it's more complicated than it seems. And what I really want to ask is, are Connie Lake and Namaya Valley colonial place names, or are they indigenous place names? And I would think that they're both. So moving on, a second example, Tsilhot'in Chi is Alexis Creek, but it's obviously more complicated than that. This is that main map I was talking about before. Hopefully you've been able to see it a little bit. This is Tsilhqot'in territory with their place names. And this time we're going to zoom in on this location, and we're going to talk about this name. So there's two versions, two main versions, one with the suffix ko, which refers to a river, or the other with the suffix chi, which means tail, and it's a Tsilhqot'in place naming technique that sort of talks about creeks that flow out of lakes that are long and skinny, as if they're the tail of the lake. And with each of those place names, there's multiple versions. There's an older version. So for instance, Tŝilhqot'in Yako, and it merges together over time to Tŝilhqot'in Ko. But the more popular name for the creek is Tŝilhqot'in Chi. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's about, 20 different ways of spelling this one particular place name based on the different ways that people pronounce it. And so since this is an oral language and the orthography is new, we're retroactively applying a writing system to an oral language. And this is what ends up happening. The colonial place name for this one, Alexis Creek, was named after Chief Alexis, who Akherganakrid recognized as a leader of the Chilcotin Indians. Alexis is a Tŝilhqot'in name for Elegasi, and Elegasi was born ilhqot'in, which is a related nation mixed with a carrier ancestry to the north and Shuswap ancestry to the east, but their own unique people, a smaller nation. And he was from there and married in, and because they're a matriarchal society, he ended up moving into the Tŝilhqot'in territory and taking on a bit of a leadership role. It's also further complicated because the band that sort of flowed from his village at the time, which was later wiped out by smallpox intentionally. Alexis Creek Indian Band was the name for the longest time, but their land was appropriated and they were moved to a place called Redstone, or Tsilhqot'in, which is the Tŝilhqot'in name for that place. And it just so happens there's another colonial community nearby that's also called Redstone, and it causes major concerns for emergency vehicles. The official name was Alexis Creek since 1911, but in 2019 it was adopted to be Tŝilhqot'in Chi. So you can see now this name, this one of many versions, has been plastered in stone, well, on metal, on this road sign, and alongside Alexis Creek, where the two names are entangled together on the same piece of built environment. So what's going on? It's not as cut and dry as we often think about the Indigenous and the colonial. And a big part of it is Anglicization. So how colonial place names are derived from Tŝilhqot'in place names. So there's lots of examples here. Chezikit from Chilcotin, Cheetah Creek, Yako, Tasiko River, Dasiko, the list goes on. This is just a sample. But it also kind of goes the other way around too. So, colonial or English place names that have been morphed into Tŝilhqot'in phonetics. So Kushan Bebi means Kushan's lake, and it's named for Quizon Creek. And Muldam Be'yakot is Muldum's Creek, and that's Meldrum Creek. So it's the language shift goes both ways. These are sort of the two only examples that I've been able to find, but I'm sure there's others. Translation is another major reason why these toponymies are tangled up together. And first, from Tŝilhqot'in to English, it's not as common as you might think. But in this case, this was one of the only ones I could find, but Dedigulin and all of its versions, Dediko, means river from where there are marmots. And people around here call marmots groundhogs. And that creek, in BC's gazetteer is Groundhog Creek. So it's a translation of the Tŝilhqot'in name. But again, translation can go the other way. And these are the only two examples I've been able to find, but it's quite interesting. Big Creek wasn't accurate on most colonial maps spatially until the 1930s or later. It was also labeled Deer Creek and often confused with Churn Creek. But in Tŝilhqot'in, for the longest time, this place name, or the name for this creek, was Gaslangulinyako or Gaslanko, which means river from where there are many snowshoe hare. But after the name Big Creek was applied, many people started calling that creek Yakok'uncha, which means Big Creek. And it might have been because there's a lake in the area also called Biguncha, which is Big Lake. So that might have been a factor, or maybe not. The other one is Raven Lake, which is a lake in the central Chilcotin, which, in Tŝilhqot'in, they call Datanbi or Datanchobi, which literally means Raven Lake. But there aren't other lakes in the territory that are named this way directly after an animal. So it's quite odd. It's quite an odd phenomenon. All right, get back into the thing here. So another confusing element is this new generation of names. So place names that have popped up since the time of settler engagements. So Jakbatlachi, Jack's Meadow, for haying, for ranching, this ranching economy that moved in. Patrick where Patrick cut wild hay. Big Joe Bakaya, named after Chief Big Joe of SD Law community, it means Big Joe's area. Ilhqot'in is a place name which means broken hay sleigh. And then Moostlechet is an indicator. Well, moose, there was no Tŝilhqot'in name for moose. They moved in at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is the last sort of set of entangled relationships I've found between these two toponymies. The first, Tŝilhqot'in place names that are actually in the English language. So a name that if you saw on a map, you would immediately think is Colonial just because it's in English, but it turns out to be a very well-used colloquial place name for Tŝilhqot'in people and not really for settler society. Freddy Meadow, Twin Lakes. Twin Lakes is a place name concept where two similar sized and shaped lakes are right beside each other. There's sort of a naming system that follows that. Gravel Lake, Sugarcane Jacks, but it also, it also flows into the built environment where we look at place names on Google Maps and you'll see things like Tšilhqot'in Band Office or Chief Frank Joe Health Center. And these are very clearly Indigenous place names, but in the English language. So a few tentative conclusions that I'm hoping we can think about as cartographers. So yes, place names are windows onto relationships between languages and landscapes that we've known through the work of Franz Boas and others for over 100 years, but not just how they persist, but also how they change and morph. Place names are windows onto worldviews and cultural perspectives, but also the ways they transform in relation to each other through time. Place names are windows onto social and political negotiations, but that shouldn't be our only focus when we're considering the richness of these toponymies and the complexities of, that they share with us through our understanding of them. They're not just of this official recognition, what name goes on the sign, what name goes on the map of Canada, but they're also everyday acts of representation. They're acts of speech. They're represented on people's tongues. Histories of peoples and places, place names are representative of those, and we've known that for a long time. But this is a dynamic relationship through time and space. And so when we think about Indigenous place names, we can't just be thinking about the names in pre-contact or the names before societies and cultures clashed and merged and changed and are completely entangled and irreparably so. A few more conclusions before I finish up here. Place names are textual, like we see on maps, like we see on signs, but we can't forget that they're also oral and they're cognitive. We use these names in our own minds. We use them to navigate, we use them to understand the world around us. They exist simultaneously in overlapping, interconnecting, confusing ways on a multiplicity of maps in minds and on mouths. Place names are variations. Place name variations are not something to fear, but they're something to embrace, something to respect and find ways to celebrate. And that's a real challenge for a cartographer. There's not enough space on the map to put everything down. Even if some of these, variations are actually the result of inconsistencies and errors, and we can find them. Place names we see on maps and signs are always distilled representations of a wider phenomenon. So we as cartographers often want, what's the best data set to use? Just send it to me and I'll apply it. But we have to think that data set has gone through, for instance, even if it's just a place name inventory, there's an incredible amount of processing and thought and research and time that's gone into producing one name on the map. So we can't think of what we're doing as, the authoritative act. What we're doing is representing the data that we have and whatever that data is. So we should find ways as cartographers to embrace this ambiguity. And I find the best way is to move away from this idea of a single map or a single paper output. Instead, we should be thinking about digital platforms that are interactive, where you can turn on and off layers and play with it yourself. And more Indigenous communities are creating maps like this, and it's really useful. You can also, embed audio and video and stories and legends and art to really try and interact with a cultural landscape that's diverse and rich and interlocked with various elements of culture that are really complex. And last but not least, I want sort of as a takeaway to say that the line between Indigenous and colonial toponymies isn't as clear as we expect it to be. That's sort of the thread I'm trying to push here, but maybe that also is in other areas too. So I'll leave it there, and if there's any questions, I'd be very happy to answer.